Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this press briefing. My name is Coralie Verhagen, and I am the Communication Officer for Biodiversa Plus, the European Biodiversity Partnership. And before we get started, I have a few very short housekeeping announcements to make. So first of all, please note that this event is being recorded. Secondly, you're welcome to keep your videos on or off, but please make sure that your microphones are turned off. You will be able to turn your microphone back on during the Q&A at the end of this presentation. During the Q&A, questions can be asked either through the chat or directly by using the hand raising function and asking it out loud when you're given the floor. And then lastly, we are going to be circulating a short write-up of the press briefing after the event. And any questions you may have after this press briefing can be addressed to me directly through the email address that is shown on the screen. So with this few announcements out of the way, let's get started. First and foremost, thank you all for joining our press briefing on effectively implementing the COP15 targets in Europe for nature and the people, and more specifically with a focus on what science tells us. As you may be aware, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted at the Biodiversity Summit COP15 in December. To meet the GBF's goal, governments are to enhance their policies and monitoring capabilities. To assist with this, Biodiversa Plus is organizing a forum with scientists and policymakers to identify gaps in the implementation of the GBF 30 by 30 targets. The Science Policy Forum will be held next Tuesday and can be followed online. The agenda and registration link will be shared in the short write-up of the press briefing. It will gather speakers from the CBD Secretariat, the European Commission, as well as members from environmental protection agencies and researchers from biodiversa projects. Today's press briefing really aims to introduce the theme and stakes of the forum and to provide an overview of the science policy debates surrounding the Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as offer how Biodiversa Plus aims to support the implementation of this framework. Once again, thank you all for joining our press briefing. And without further ado, I give the floor to Frédéric Lemaître, who is Senior Science Policy Officer for Biodiversa Plus. Frédéric will provide a short introduction on Biodiversa Plus, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and specifically its goal A, and how Biodiversa Plus links up policymakers, conservation actors, and scientists for an evidence-based and effective implementation of the GBF targets. Frédéric, the floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Coralie, and good morning to all. So indeed, I'm happy to introduce Biodiversa Plus's work in support of the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This framework was adopted at the 15th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity in last December. Next slide, please. So in practice, it's an international policy agenda for nature until 2030, carrying the general vision of putting nature on a path to recovery by 2030. And to do so, it's articulated around four strategic goals, which you can see on the right-hand side here. So first, there's a conservation of biodiversity, meaning maintaining and restoring biodiversity and ecosystems. These targets you'll find under this goal gather, for example, topics like spatial planning, restoration, protected areas, but also conservation in the face of direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, for instance, pollution or climate change. Then there's the second target on the second overall goal, which is a sustainable use of biodiversity. This is by stopping the decline of nature's contributions to people, which relates to materials and food production, but also to regulating services, which means services like air or water cleaning provided by nature, flood management or pollination, for instance, the main ones. Third, you have the equitable sharing of benefits or ensuring a fair and equitable access to biological resources. In practice, this means facilitating access to genetic resources and ensuring the equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources and of associated traditional knowledge where relevant. And finally, you have a fourth objective around enabling implementation And this is really developing sustainable tools and solutions towards achieving the overall vision of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, to 2050. And under this strategic goal, the objective is to ensure the mobilization and development of the means to implement the framework. And by this, you can understand financial resources, skills, competences, and especially science and evidence. The framework also includes mechanisms for planning, monitoring, reporting, and reviewing its implementation, as well as a resource mobilization plan. So how does Biodiversa Plus fit in there? So the Global Biodiversity Framework highlights the prominent role of science in helping guide and track its implementation. And as the European Biodiversity Partnership, we are established in the context of the Horizon Europe Framework Programme for Research and Development of the European Commission. And we are a network of ministries and agencies across Europe that support excellent research on biodiversity with impact for society and policy. In practice, this means that we gather both research policy actors and environmental policy actors from 36 European and associated countries, and we collaborate with several non-European countries. And together we coordinate on research strategies, we harmonize efforts in monitoring of biodiversity in Europe, but also importantly, we fund new research that supports conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. This new knowledge seeks to help revert biodiversity loss, but also tackle some of our most pressing challenges like climate change. So we make every effort for this new knowledge to be relevant and used by people and organizations from policy or society. We'll be working together for at least the next 7 years, mobilizing a budget of over 800 million euros, combining contributions from our national partners and the European Commission, and all this to enable research and innovation to fully play its role in achieving policy objectives for biodiversity. And this is the exact purpose of the Science Policy Forum we are kicking off in Prague next week, in which we will be bringing forward knowledge and capacities from research and innovation to facilitate the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So why do we need research and innovation in support of the framework's implementation? Next slide, please. So in the forum, we'll be focusing on some of the most emblematic targets of the framework, like the 10% full protection and 30% partial protection targets under the goal A, conservation, that I presented earlier. We have this major framework for stopping biodiversity loss adopted by governments of the United Nations at a global level, with general targets like the ones you see here on the screen. And the reality is that implementing these targets on the ground in a way that does help stop biodiversity loss is neither easy nor straightforward. And this is where initiatives like Biodiversa come into play. To give you a concrete example, for instance, only 1% of EU marine areas are strictly protected today. And according to the Global Biodiversity Framework, at least 30% of oceans should be partially protected and 10% should be strictly protected in the future. This means important efforts to establish new marine protected areas in hope of helping improve biodiversity. Yet, this is not automatic, and an uninformed development of protected areas can render them largely useless from an ecological perspective and put all these efforts to waste. Next slide, please. So here an example with our buffer project, which looked into where and why marine protected areas are ecologically and socio-economically effective, meaning where do they work for both nature and people. What Buffer showed, analyzing over 100 MPA marine protected areas worldwide, is that different levels of protection have very different levels of effectiveness, especially depending on how far they are placed from fully protected areas. So different levels of regulation of protected areas means, for instance, is fishing allowed with what fishing gear, but also other uses of the area like snorkeling or scuba diving, as you can see on the next slide here. And looking at these different levels of regulations, Buffer showed that on the one hand, low level of regulation are never efficient for nature. And on the other, moderate to high levels in partially protected areas. So moderate to high level of partial protection are largely ecologically efficient for nature and people, but only when placed close or adjacent to a fully protected area. Later on, the buffer team was able to use these findings to inform the implementation of policy objectives, showing, for instance, that in the Mediterranean Sea, 95% of protected areas do not have sufficient regulations in place, and that out of the 6% of the full area of the Mediterranean Sea, which is covered by marine protected areas, only 0.23% are ecologically efficient, so working for conservation of biodiversity. This gives you a clear insight into what research can bring to guide the effective implementation of the conservation objectives of the global biodiversity framework. Another challenge in the implementation of protected areas is not only to make them work for nature, but also for people. Can we make such a significant development of protected areas on land a reality, given the multiple uses and occupations already going on? Next slide, please. There also, research can help uncover best possible options and compromises. Some of the work of our ENVISION project is pioneering the development of shared visions for protection between the many actors of a given landscape. These are companies, local people, and authorities involved or impacted by the development and management of a protected area. In practice, this means that ENVISION developed high-end scientific tools like ecological modeling to represent the landscape and how it works. And then they brought the key people from this landscape around the table to formulate the problems they face, make the choices they would make to input into the models, and in turn, collectively develop different scenarios for socioeconomic aspects and for biodiversity aspects in the landscape, and develop a shared vision for the development and management of a protected area in this landscape. So next slide, please. They've tested this inclusive conservation approach on 4 sites globally already, which you can see here in Sweden, the Netherlands, Spain, and the US. This resulted in soothing the tensions around protected areas, developing local and regional knowledge alliances composed of the key stakeholders, and these alliances continue today. And this helped better frame also, in some instances, multiple stakeholders' objectives as regards the protected area and revise development and management plans. This example highlights in particular how research can use evidence to support the mediation and management of trade-offs for different stakeholders in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework's targets. Next slide, please. I have a last example. In Biodiversa Plus, we support research and innovation. And I wanted to highlight today also how research can be a source of a game-changing innovation here with our ReefFutures project. So ReefFutures looked at coral reefs and rocky reefs. You can see an example, coral on the left and rocky on the right, of which, and all around the world, they looked at fish species traits in these reefs. So the species traits, they are, for instance, diet of a species, the habitats it uses, or the size of the species. And it gives us a better idea of the impact of the species and its role in the functioning of a given ecosystem. And all around the world, it means that ReefFutures looked at 89 regions from Norway to southern Chile. And they found some similar trait composition in fish communities, even when ecosystems were on completely opposite sides of the planet. This was consistently true as long as an ecosystem had similar environmental conditions, for instance, the temperature of the ecosystem or the nutrients available in the ecosystem. In Japan and Chile, for example, ReefFutures found a very similar composition of traits of fish communities, even though the species were not the same at all. This is the first time that anyone looked at the similarity of the traits and of the functioning of these reefs. highlighting a backbone of 21 combination of these traits that fish communities can have that exist all around the world. So what does this mean in practice for conservation efforts? First, ReefFutures results show that we can potentially anticipate how ecosystems functioning might change as the environment changes. So we could, for instance, see how climate change will impact or change fish communities, all around the world, because we know there is this link. And importantly, secondly, it means that we can potentially transfer similar reef management and conservation strategies in completely different places, as long as these have similar environmental conditions. This is important because there are a lot of places with coral reefs where funding or capacities for science-based management are limited. So we might just be able to transfer successful conservation strategies effective in certain parts of the world and apply them in other regions if these have similar environments, because there is a same functional organization in the ecosystem. Now, enough examples from me. True to our cooperation spirit in Biodiversa Plus, in the forum we're organizing next week, we're bringing together national policymakers together with scientists to learn and engage with major coordination efforts at international scales for the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Some of these initiatives representatives are here today, and it's my privilege to leave the floor to them to highlight knowledge and capacities from research and innovation to facilitate the implementation of the global framework in a way that works both for nature and people. Thank you, and back to you, Coralie.
Thank you very much, Frédéric, for setting the scene of this press briefing and providing us with very nice examples. I would like to now give the floor to Madhu. Madhu is the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas. She has over 25 years of experience in the field of conservation and has engaged in policy-relevant research on topics ranging from protected area policy and threatened species conservation to human-wildlife conflict, conservation prioritization, and governance. Today, she will introduce the concept of key biodiversity areas, what they are, and their importance for EU's biodiversity commitments. Madhu, please.
Thank you very much, Coralie. I'm very pleased to join you all for this briefing today. As we all know, the first priority theme of the Biodiversity Protect Research Call focuses on knowledge for identifying priority conservation areas, establishing effective and resilient ecological networks, enhancing species-based protection, and preserving genetic diversity. Today, I will briefly talk about key biodiversity areas, outlining their importance to the EU and its biodiversity commitments. A more detailed presentation on KBAs is scheduled for the Science Policy Forum next week, starting 18th April. Next slide, please. The IPBES reports in 2019 communicated widespread scientific consensus that direct and indirect drivers of change have accelerated during the past 50 years. This has resulted in a steep decline of nature and its vital contributions to people. Nature, which is essential for human existence and a good quality of life, is in decline. Next slide, please. As we've just heard, in December 2022 in Montreal, 196 countries, including the European Union, adopted an ambitious global biodiversity framework in Montreal. The vision is a focus on reversing the degradation of biodiversity and living in harmony with nature. Now, the EU biodiversity strategy commits the EU to protect at least 30% of land and 30% of sea, to strictly protect 10% of land and 10% of sea, and to establish a truly coherent trans-European nature network. It also requests member states to ensure no deterioration in conservation trends and status of all protected habitats and species by 2030, and at least 30% of the species and habitats that are not currently in a favorable status reach that status or show a strong positive trend. The EU also has raised the level of ambition and commitment worldwide, recognizing its increasing impact on biodiversity beyond its borders. Next slide, please. With limited time and limited financial resources, science-based support is needed to guide prioritization efforts. And this is where key biodiversity areas come in. They're useful in helping inform what and where to protect as protected areas or OECMs, where to manage better or restore biodiversity. Next slide, please. The Key Biodiversity Area Standard is a global standard. It's developed through global consultation, wide consultation. Key biodiversity areas are sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. The bottom-up nature of this process is really key because KBAs are identified through national or subnational processes with data, ownership, convening all within the country. So in a way, it combines sovereignty with consistency, comparability, and rigor that comes from national processes applied to the global standard. Next slide, please. There are 5 broad criteria that define key biodiversity areas. And I'm not going to go into details of each criteria, but these criteria include a focus on biodiversity that is threatened, biodiversity that is geographically restricted to certain places on Earth, ecological integrity, meaning intact ecological communities, biological processes such as species aggregations, and irreplaceability through quantitative analysis. So KBA criteria are designed to capture biodiversity at genetic, species, and ecosystem levels. Collectively, the criteria identify ways in which a site can be important for the global persistence of biodiversity. It's important to remember that the data is derived from various sources, including citizen science. Next slide, please. So KBAs are also a good example of how science can inform policy. In the next few slides, I'm going to show how they can be useful to governments to set national policies for protection, management, and restoration. They can be used by businesses, private sector, and the finance industry to avoid risks posed by development to areas of high biodiversity importance. Next slide, please. In Albania, as an example, more than half of the country's territory, approximately 50%, is recognized as key biodiversity areas. In countries further afield, such as Mozambique, the government has recognized 29 key biodiversity areas. But the important part is that it is possible for this recognition of KBAs to be integrated into policies such as this directive on biodiversity offsets in Mozambique, where KBAs are integrated as areas to be avoided by development projects and as biodiversity offset receiving areas, particularly for cases where these are used to establish new protected areas. Next slide, please. KBA data are also provided to companies through IBAT, which is an integrated biodiversity assessment tool. This tool packages the information together with the IUCN Red List and protected planet data in a format for easy use by companies. There are guidelines for businesses on how to manage risk to biodiversity. Here we have an example of how risk mapping is used by a company called ReefFutures to recognize risks to high biodiversity areas associated with a heavy oil pipeline in Ecuador. Next slide, please. KBAs have also been integrated into the financial industry benchmarks, such as the EQUATOR principles and the International Finance Corporation Performance Standard 6 to assess and manage environmental risk. KBAs and other critical habitat areas are also recognized as areas of high risk in the guidance note for Standard 3 issued by the European Investment Bank. Next slide. So KBAs overall are not only based on rigorous science, widely adopted globally, but the standard has significant global support and backing. The breadth of the key biodiversity area partnership, as you can see on this slide, which maintains and supports the program, includes numerous international NGOs, such as BirdLife, Conservation International, WCS, WWF, etc., but also intergovernmental organizations such as, and donor agencies such as CEPF, the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and the IUCN. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Madhu, for this overview of key biodiversity areas and their importance. Our next speaker will build upon this with his intervention on connecting biodiversity protection efforts across Europe. Piero Visconti is the Biodiversity, Ecology, Conservation Research Group Leader at IASA, the International Institute for Applied System Analysis. He's also project coordinator for Natura Connect, a Horizon Europe project working towards the development of the Trans-European Nature Network, which he will introduce for us. Piero, please.
Thank you, Coralie. I thought I would start with a nice reminder of why we are here in my first slide. So this is our natural heritage. These pieces are part of our biodiversity heritage, and some of those, like the beluga sturgeon here on the top left, or the European hamster right in the middle, are critically endangered and could disappear from this planet in our lifetime. Next slide. So to protect our precious natural heritage, the world countries are committed to 23 global targets and 4 goals by 2030, as you heard before. I refer in the first 3 slides to the first 3, which are closely linked to the 36 projects funded by biodiversa+ that will kick off next week. The first target called for all countries to have biodiversity inclusive spatial plans that ensure that any extractive or productive activities do not threaten the areas of highest biodiversity importance. Next slide. Safeguarding the most precious places is not enough. We need to allow the recovery of degraded places. And this is the focus of Target 2, which commits countries to restore 30% of degraded terrestrial, inland waters, and marine ecosystems. Next slide. However, avoiding further habitat loss and favoring recovery is important, but many habitats and species need active long-term management to survive in the long term. And this is the focus of Target 3, which commits signatory parties to legally protect and effectively manage 30% of all ecosystems, for instance, through protected areas or other effective area-based conservation measure. We now have almost 20% of land and 10% of the oceans that are protected, but there is still some work to do, especially in ensuring that these protected areas work as a connected system. Next slide. Why I stress the role of systems thinking in conservation? Because biodiversity knows no border. The responsibility of conserving fire salamander, as you can see from the top left, is shared across more than 20 countries in Europe. And many of these countries host a local variation of the species, also known in scientific terms as subspecies, that are unique of these countries. However, other countries share cross-border population. Also, on the bottom right, you can see the range of the European wild bison, still endangered, according to IUCN. These populations are fragmented and tiny, and therefore the long-term survival depends on coordinated efforts across countries to reconnect them, to ensure that they have large swaths of land to roam and increase the tiny populations. Next slide. Many species are migratory and spend their breeding season in one country, for instance, storks, and cross many other countries twice a year to spend the winter on lower latitudes. These are actually real track from GPS of storks. You see some of them spend the winter in Spain, many continue lower latitude towards Africa. Conservation effort to protect storks will be vain in Europe if we don't act in the breeding range or during the migration, for instance, to address legal poaching activities. So we need to make sure that there are coordinated efforts across distant protected areas across many countries. Next slide. Europe, especially the European Union, have led the way in terms of conservation ambitions in the last decades and continue to be a role model. 3 years ago, the Commission and 37 member states are committed to 3 targets. The first of which you heard before is to legally protect at least 30% of land, including inland waters, as well as 30% of marine systems by 2030. And in addition to the Kunming-Montreal protocol, they also committed the 27 member states to have 1/3 of these strictly protected, bearing in mind that only we have about 3% on land and much less than that is strictly protected today in Europe. They also committed European countries to restore at least 20% of Europe on land and 20% of the marine systems, not just degraded areas, 20% of the entire extent of Europe, to assist recovery of ecosystems towards a good ecological condition. Finally, the member states have committed to facilitate movement of species across ecological corridors that have to be multifunctional, which means that have to work for nature and people, and assist increasing ecosystem resilience through, for instance, climate change mitigation and adaptation. So clearly, as you see, quality counts as much as quantity in terms of conservation. The focus isn't merely on the 30%, but is what is the best 30% that we need to be protecting. And this is where science comes into place. Next slide. This requires a bird's-eye view of conservation needs in Europe. A panorama at the continental scale of which areas are the most important. This requires state-of-the-art data, knowledge, and tools about distribution of species, habitat, and ecosystem services across all countries. These allow countries to think about how their local action can contribute to continental and global ambitions, and provide important context to ensure that the responsibility that each country has is shared adequately and equitably to protect active habitat and species that have been overlooked by conservation. For instance, on the left, you see some alpine meadows and waterlogged lowland forests that require particular conservation efforts as they've been overlooked so far. So the projects that will be presented next week provide this overview, this panorama look on conservation priorities. And crucially, they provide the multidisciplinary expertise needed to tackle conservation issues from all aspects: ecological, social, economic, and political. The kind of questions that you'll be seeing answered next week include, for instance, what are the areas that should be protected in addition to the existing ones? Where should we focus on strict protection, and where should we ensure that we allow sustainable food and timber production within other effective area-based conservation measures? And the logos and names that you see on the bottom are of some of the projects that tackle specifically. Next slide. Another important question that science can assist policy into is, where should we manage the countryside to create wildlife corridors that allow species to move safely across areas between national park and other reserves? This, for instance, is quite important for large carnivores like the Iberian lynx and the wolf, to reconnect local subpopulation to allow this large meta-population, as we say, to basically thrive in the long term. Equally, science can help in thinking about stopovers for long-distance migratory species like the barnacle geese that you see on the map here, that come to visit us in Western and Central Europe every winter from Greenland and Iceland. Next slide, please. These questions are not merely scientific, they're very practical questions that require coordinated efforts, as we've seen. This is why one common denominator of all projects that you'll hear about next week is to include multidisciplinary expertise and international teams. A case in point is the project that I have the privilege to coordinate, Natura Connect, which is featured in this slide. This is funded by Horizon Europe program of the European Union and involves 22 organizations from academia, NGOs, and public sector. You will be hearing more about this project on Tuesday. And with that, I thank you and hand over to Coralie.
Thank you very much, Piero, for this insightful presentation on why connecting protected areas is crucial for their effectiveness. Our last speaker today is Judith Fisher. She is the Director of Fisher Research and Associate Professor at the University of Western Australia. She has also co-chaired the evaluation of 3 biodiversa calls for research. Her intervention today will focus on the importance of transnational biodiversity projects, how they can generate knowledge and support the implementation of the global biodiversity framework. Judith, the floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Coralie, and good morning to everybody. I think we've heard from all our previous speakers really why it's so important for projects to cross across national borders. We've had plenty of examples which show that. And so now I'd like to really outline how that also assists with implementing the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide, please. Now, this is just a statement, a fact, I think, which is really important. Then we all need to remember and keep this in the back of our mind when we are talking about nature. It is where we all live and it is all part of us. Next slide, please. So the vision, mission, aims and targets which sit within the Global Biodiversity Framework provide Europe with a measurable framework. In the past, we haven't had measurable frameworks, but we do now have that. And these measurable framework will allow European countries and across Europe to really take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, which we hope will put the path of nature towards recovery for both the people and the planet. Now, some of the key aspects which sit behind the Global Biodiversity Framework are it really needs to be a whole of government approach to how the Global Biodiversity Framework aims, targets, missions, etc. are implemented. It needs to be the whole of society, and it needs to incorporate the different value systems which reflect that nature embodies different concepts for different people. Once again, a further reason why it's so critically important for the biodiversity projects to include such transnational importance into the research, as these values and cultures are differ greatly across countries. Next slide, please. So what Biodiversa requires from all the projects which are implemented is high quality research, transnational impact. So it needs to have impact across nations, not just in one nation or in one place or one ecosystem. The research projects need to have policy outcomes. So it's not pure science for science. It's how we make use of that science, which can be to work towards policy and to deliver policy outcomes. But throughout the whole of the process of the research, it's really critically important, and this is a criteria which Biodiversa adopts, is that stakeholder and societal engagement is involved throughout the whole of the research. So it's very much about researchers, community, government, policymakers, and all sorts of stakeholders working closely together to ensure the outcomes of those projects can deliver on all sorts of aims, targets, and policies. But in particular, now we have the Global Biodiversity Framework. That is exactly what the GBF is saying to us. Next slide, please. So once again, I did mention a little bit before about different values, but what the GBF framework does provide, these measurable aims and targets, which will assist the Europeans to supported by biodiversity research to really integrate biodiversity values into government policy. So just looking at this from the IPBES values assessment, we need to start thinking really about different worldviews, different knowledge systems, how those values affect the different people that we're working with, but most importantly, how we bring those values into the research. So Biodiversity's approach of incorporating stakeholders from many different categories really does reinforce what the Global Biodiversity Framework is saying to us. Next slide, please. So when we start to think about this, another really thing that the GBF recognises is how do we measure success? So the GBF recognises and requires to measure success, we must have political will. It's not just about conservation of the land and the place, it's about the incorporation of political will, stakeholder input to policy, recognition at the highest level of government, and cooperation of all levels of government and all actors of society. So these words sit within the GBF framework. So by incorporating transdisciplinary approaches, transnational approaches, and stakeholder involvement into all of the biodiversity calls, this really ensures that European countries are able to implement the global biodiversity framework from a very strong evidence base. Next slide, please. Now, as we've heard, biodiversity is not constrained by national borders. So if we just sit within borders, we could have real problems because biodiversity is everywhere. Those lovely slides of the animals traveling all around the world, the birds, really does emphasize how biodiversity can move and doesn't sit still. So the projects which require these transnational partnerships are really going to add a lot of value to the biodiversity research outcomes. It'll add value to the national projects and national project frameworks, but also enhance research outcomes through the cross-fertilisation of expertise, with differing expertise, knowledge bases, systems and communications. But not only that, it also adds indirect value. And that indirect value comes through the incorporation of a very wide range of cultures, ideas and value systems, including that extended stakeholder relationships and much wider social understanding and inclusive creative thinking. It's building on partnerships which further advance the European implementation of the GBF. This has been a critical and, from my perspective, strategically clever part of the Biodiversity Plus research projects, that this is incorporated into all research projects. Next slide, please. So I'll just quickly go through a couple of the themes from the GBF, which have been in the past and into the future linked to not only to knowledge gaps, but to also the GBF goals and targets, and which really shows biodiversity work is working towards implementation of the GBF. Next slide, please. So the biodiverse call on restore calls, my apologies, that actually responds to the GBF Goal A and Target 2. Now they are written there, and you can see there, and it's also been reinforced by the earlier slides of how all of those other knowledge bases are coming into this. But this is the one specifically about effective restoration. The projects funded through that call have now been operating for a year or two, and we'll be really interested to see the outcomes from those projects. Next, please. So here, really with this biodiverse restore call, a couple of projects which were funded, particularly working across water. The research outcomes are going to provide Europe with transnational and societal evidence to support policy and implementation of both Goal A and 2 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide, please. This is going to provide evidence, and which is very, very strong within the GBF, is we must have evidence to do what we want to do. So these projects are providing evidence, particularly across waterways, wetlands, land and sea. Next slide, please. So the current research call, which is still in an ongoing way, is BiodiverMon. This is all about how do we get effective monitoring and consistent monitoring at a transnational space, not necessarily just nationally, but transnationally across the whole of Europe. So once again, that one is answering target 21 within the Global Biodiversity Framework, where we must have the best available data and make use of that knowledge. Next slide, please. So coming up, the next research call will be around nature-based solutions, and once again, referring back to the Global Biodiversity Global Biodiversity Framework, Target 11 specifically does refer to not only restoring, but nature-based solutions, but how those nature-based solutions really do enhance nature's contributions to people, which is a significant contribution to the Global Biodiversity Framework. Those words, nature's contribution to people, are consistent throughout the framework. So the next call coming will once again be specific to a particular target, which will assess the European countries to implement the Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide, please. Now this is, as has been mentioned earlier, and this is the Biodiv Protect, and the call results will be announced next week, and all the upcoming projects. This one is specifically able to address Target 2 and Target 3. Next slide, please. Now, this is obviously on everybody's mind, is about business and biodiversity. The meeting in Canada in December, for the very first time, there were a very, very large number of businesses present when that global biodiversity framework was decided. So we really need now to not only conserve, restore and protect, but we really need to start working on how do we really change the way business does their business around nature. Next slide, please. So where will this go and how does that fit within Biodiversa's work and Biodiversa Plus? So Target 15 within the Global Biodiversity Framework requires large transnational companies and financial institutions, so it's not just the business, but those who are lending and supporting the funds, to regularly monitor and disclose any risks, dependencies and impacts they may have on biodiversity. So this is really an important aspect of the transnational approach, which is incorporated into biodiversity projects, because it provides now the opportunity to bring many more businesses into those stakeholder groups, and then which will assist the alignment with the global biodiversity framework around businesses. So it's a critical moment as we move forward that the global biodiversity framework now enables interlinkages between business and biodiversity, and the transnational approach is really very significant. So Target 15 will be addressed through that transnational and stakeholder approach within the biodiversity projects. Next slide, please. So I guess what is really, really important here from the signing of that or the final discussions, what does this do for Europe? It has actually now enabled significant work going forward for the European countries to really bring more and more of this biodiverse approach into the research calls, because they sit so timely and within the global biodiversity framework as it has been agreed to. So some of the key opportunities for Europe now with the biodiversity framework is it provides a framework with aims and measurable targets. It is akin to the Paris Agreement for climate. So we now have an agreement for both climate and biodiversity, and we need to work very closely on both of those together. It advances the outcomes for Biodiversa Plus research calls, and it enhances transnational collaboration, policy and wide inclusive engagement of society. So in summary, this really does, the framework does provide outcomes for Europe, really is, they're measurable. It's advancing national outcomes for CBD reporting, and also ensuring transnational synergies, knowledge and societal advancement. All of that is in all of the Biodiversa Plus projects. Next slide, please. So as we've said before, biodiversity does not recognise borders. Thank you. Back to you, Coralie.
Thank you very much, Judith, and many thanks to all of our speakers today. Please don't leave just yet, as we are now opening the floor to questions. So questions can be addressed in the chat or by using the hand raising function. Please make sure to mention who you're asking the question to, and also your affiliation and country. I see that there was already a question in the chat, and that Frédéric has already answered it. So, but maybe Frédéric, you want to answer it directly here? Yes, of course. So it was just to repeat the elements around the marine protected areas. So indeed, so far in Europe, we have elements that only 1% is protected, whereas we're moving towards a 1% fully protected, sorry, and we're moving as part of the EU 2030 strategy towards 10% to be protected. And what I repeated in the chat is that in the Mediterranean, in particular, our buffer project worked in the subsequent, in the
after the project, actually, the researchers continued with their results, and they were able to show that 95% of protected areas in the Mediterranean do not have sufficient regulations in place to ensure ecological effectiveness, and that out of the 6% of the whole Mediterranean Sea covered by marine protected areas, only 0.23% are ecologically efficient. So this means this highlights the importance of the planning of network of protected areas, which was also highlighted by Piero, more on land and looking at migrants, but here it's more in the marine realms.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. So like I mentioned, the floor is now open to you for anyone who has any question. So go ahead if you have any question. Oh, I see there's a follow-up question from Raya. And she asks what the measures should be in the Black Sea. I think, Frédéric, the question is for you still.
Yeah, so obviously our project investigator, Joachim Claudet, would be a better place to give a more definite answer. I think what's important in terms of the results they showed is that so you need fully protected areas close to partially ones for the partial ones to be effective, to be working for biodiversity. And something else they showed in subsequent steps also is the importance of not only having target regulations for the protected area, but also making sure that you have means to implement these regulations. So I think these would be two key avenues of answer which would apply. But we can put you in contact also with Joachim. Would be happy to do so if you would like to reach out to him to have some more specific guidance to the Black Sea.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. Yes, and so for anyone, if you have questions after this press briefing, so like I mentioned, we are going to do a short write-up, but any questions can also be addressed by email, and we'll do our best to answer them shortly. I see another follow-up question still from Raya on what should governments do to protect biodiversity? What should we do more? So what should we do more in links of the Natura 2000 protection? Maybe Piero, it's about Natura 2000. I think your insights might be interesting here. The question was asked in the chat.
So as I said, the existing network is an achievement in its own right. It's the largest coordinated reserve network in the world, and that's something to applaud. There is an issue of management effectiveness. Some of the existing sites don't have implemented management plans, and there are actually even countries that have been in breach of the directives and under there are legal cases in the European Court of Justice for those. So an obvious thing to do is make sure that an existing network is effectively managed and follow basically the guidelines of the birds and habitat directives in doing that. The other thing that countries can do is make sure that just like in the example that Frédéric gave for marine areas, we have buffer areas on land. Just to give you an example, over 69%, so basically 70% of protected areas in Europe are smaller than 1 kilometer square, which means that they basically are vulnerable to any disturbance, which could be noise, pollution, or just people trespassing and disturbing species that are quite sensitive to human disturbance. So expanding existing sites to provide larger areas that are kind of more naturally buffered against disturbance is an obvious thing to do. Lastly, as I said, there are some species and ecosystems, and I can refer you to some specific literature on those that have been enjoying less protection than others. So one of the things that the Commission has asked the countries to do is make sure that the network is complete in the sense that caters for all of these habitats and species that have been underprotected so far. And that can easily lead us to the 30% that we need and perhaps even exceed it. 30% is obviously a very good political target, but it's not necessarily enough in its own right. It may well be that in some countries we need more than 30% to make sure that everything is fully protected.
Thank you, Piero. I think that was a very nice, yeah, very comprehensive reply to this question. I don't see any other questions in the chat, and I see that we only just have 3 minutes left. So. Oh, I see there's a question here in the chat. So I think it's addressed to you as well, Piero. You mentioned the Iberian lynx and wolf. Do you have any insights on how effective protection laws of those species have been so far in Spain? Do you have any?
Yeah, so for the Iberian lynx, actually, this is one of the best success story in Europe. It's something that I repeat to people if they need some kind of the dose of good positive news about biodiversity. It has been delisted from critically endangered to endangered by IUCN. So it means that it's still a bit in trouble, but it went from very few dozens, far less than 100 individual. I believe the last count is over 200 and possibly 300. I need to check the numbers. So I actually increased several folds in population size, thanks to local effort by, for instance, the Estación Biológica de Doñana in Seville and some local authorities, and thanks to life projects from the European Union. So this is a very good case of European funding and local conservation efforts really working well. For the wolf, I don't know as much. I do know that the Iberian wolf is thriving, and interestingly now there are cases of wolves from Switzerland and France, so basically moving west from France, crossing the Pyrenees, and we have the first pack of wolves in Catalonia since several decades. So this seems also to be going well. Obviously with wolves, differently from lynx, there is more human-wildlife conflicts. I'm not sure how well they are handled, but I can try and find out and perhaps connect you with the local experts in Spain about wolves and lynx, Marta, if that's useful.
Great, thank you so much. Perfect. I think I'll wrap it up here as I'm mindful of the time. So thank you again to all of our speakers and to all of you attending. We'll provide you with a short wrap up of this event. It will include the slides of the presentation and as well as more information on the Science Policy Forum of next week. We'll also share some information on our biodiversa program, through which policy relevant scenarios were developed on possible biodiversity trajectories. These scenarios will feed future EBS assessments and will be presented later this year at a press conference. This is all, I think, for me. Thank you very much again, and this recording will also be made available should you want to refer back to it. Thank you very much to everyone, and I wish you a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks and bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.